Grandma Effie's favorite game was hide and seek. The rules were always the same. I was the hider, and she was the seeker. Let me start off by simply saying my grandmother was an intensely private woman. I have never encountered another human being in my 30 years on this spinning sphere of minerals, noise, and life met a person that could even come close to the truly jarring way that woman made me feel. Do you ever recall the first time you encountered something so profoundly forbidden? That moment when you're usually very young and you stumble across Christmas presents you were never meant to see before the holidays. Or the first time you saw roadkill on a journey home. Usually, your entire body undergoes a sensation akin to the one thing: danger. Your limbs somehow feeling heavier, stronger, more tempered to pounce in the event you are discovered. It's almost like a superpower, but one designed to help you run. This is the folly of danger, the folly of the first time you encounter something forbidden. It has a habit of giving you the opposite effect. If you were being screamed by every cell in your body to take flight, that one dissenting voice, and subsequently the one that matters most, would be that of your brain. It would be encouraging you, urging you to stay and explore the depths of this newfound treasure trove of knowledge, something you know at such a young age is never meant to be delved into, poked, prodded, or discussed. For me, the age was 9. The place was my grandparents' house. The thing? That was my grandmother's ritual. I made the critical mistake of interrupting it. The first time I stumbled across her ritual was entirely by accident. My mother had brought me to Grandma Effie's for an afternoon tea one summer in the late 90s. I don't recall what it was, but something had led Mom away from the house, electing to leave me with Grandma for a couple hours while she took care of things. From the moment the oak door groaned shut behind her with the final thump, it felt like the house I'd become intimately familiar with as a toddler was suddenly foreign and foreboding beyond comprehension. Of course, you can chalk that up entirely to being a child separated from his mother and just feeling vulnerable. But it was more than that. It was the equivalence of having your blanket ripped from your sheets in the dead of night, the safety net of your world suddenly dissipating, revealing an unknown void that could hold any number of dangerous things. When that door closed and my grandmother smiled down at me, pearly whites bared and eyes alight with interest while excitedly telling me we were going to play hide and seek, I knew that safety was gone. Grandma Effie was a reclusive woman. She didn't talk to her neighbors or anyone for that matter since she took an extended trip away before I was born. Once upon a time, I told she was a kind, intelligent, and expressive woman full of life and zest. But as time progressed, it leaked away, becoming surrounded by an ice-cold persona that kept all at a distance. With only flickers of her goodwill in the later years. On her return, however, she would show virtually no emotion to anyone who came her way, but instead a cold indifference that warned of something almost offensive. If you can imagine my confusion even at that small age when she placed her hands on my shoulders as we watched Mom go, kneeling down to smile at me when the door was shut and telling me to find the best hiding place I could. Confused, but eager to play, as any 9-year-old would be. The Victorian house I was used to seemed a far cry from the imposing structure I was exploring now. What used to be a myriad of beautiful colors now appeared piercing and menacing, as if crimson and pure white were conspiring to stab me in the back the moment I turned the corner. Shying away from their adornments, the family portraits, once seemingly comforting and endlessly full of emotions beyond the delicate blends of colors, almost appeared vacant, lifeless, and devoid of all pure things. I couldn't even say their eyes stared at me as I walked past. It was the same cold indifference my grandma usually displayed, but amplified. As I climbed the staircase to the 3rd floor, I noticed a closet that was almost perfectly blended with the wall, separated by a spare bedroom on the left and Grandma's taxidermy workshop on the right. If there was one thing that made her happy, it was that. She once found some squirrels in her front garden, cavorting by the oak tree, and elected to poison them instead of befriending them. The look of adulation on her face when she presented me with them as a Christmas gift, contrasting with the primal terror on the unfortunate squirrel's face, is something permanently etched into my memory. She always promised to show me the workshop, but up to this point had never found what she called an appropriate time to do so. The closet, an alluring and natural choice to hide in for any ambitious hide-and-seeker, was promptly made priority since the taxidermy office was locked tight. 6, 7, 8. I began tiptoeing towards the closet, her graveling foreign accent struggling with some of the more complex consonants that don't translate well to the native Japanese citizen echoing along the hall. Even 2 floors up, her tones carried through the husk of the house, bouncing off every wall and urging me to hide before her count was up. I knew she'd be ascending the stairs soon, competition and an unusual sense of panic urging me on. I slipped inside the hinges, croaking and hissing in protest as I did so. 9, 10, 11. A faint clicking sound now complementing the counting was momentarily off-putting. But with it being the afternoon, I figured she was making lunch. Hoping for a rice ball, I peered through the slits in the closet to see if I could catch a smell of the ingredients, making a feeble attempt at guessing the food. Clink, clink, clink. I heard the sound of metal meeting marble, promptly followed by a scraping sound as my eyes widened and sweat began pouring down my brow. Something resembling my grandma was ascending the stairs, with an intent so fierce I could physically feel it from where I was hidden. At the time, I didn't understand what I was looking at. To be honest, I still don't know, but I'm sure many of you reading this will. The first thing that caught my eye was the black wig. It was pure black and perfectly kept, not a single hair out of place or discolored. Grandma's normal hair was pepper gray, frayed, and usually a little messy. Next, I saw her outfit. A pure white gown, with nothing on her feet. Wasn't she cold? Where was her khakis and sweater? I couldn't understand the unusual change in outfit at the time. My child mind thought she was playing dress-up. But as she turned towards the hall, I saw her face. I saw something that convinced my younger self this wasn't my grandma, but as an adult reminded me that person was no longer with us. Her eyebrows were gone. Her eyes were devoid of emotion and her face was blank. No muscle twitched, no blemish or movement save for the smallest whisper. In a phrase, she was expressionless. The story I put out into the world in 2012 was based on her. The photo? No. But it was the closest thing I could find that connected me to that emotion I felt when I looked at her. Something so unnatural and inhuman that every fiber of my being screamed to look away, to run, to defend myself. That feeling of stumbling over something forbidden etched its way into my soul and latched onto my ribcage, daring my heart to beat louder so she would find me quicker. Hand placed over my mouth and sweat dripping from my head, I couldn't look away as she dragged herself across the hallway, eyes fixed on something out of my view. As she got closer, I could hear what she was saying, and it was enough to finally tear me away from the door and towards the back of the room to anywhere obscured and safe. I am God. They are the lambs. I am God. They are the lambs. Over and over, she whispered this ceaselessly and never breaking her expression, her hand gripping something out of view as she paced towards the next floor, scraping the knife across each door she passed before her footsteps died away. I took my hand away from my mouth and waited until I was certain she had gone. With some bravery and a lot of stupidity, I began knocking against the walls, knowing I couldn't just go out of the closet door, but desperate to have a larger safe haven. Feeling my surroundings and realizing the wall next to me was hollow, I began knocking against it harder, praying she wouldn't hear. It eventually gave way to a small hole that I eagerly pulled apart as I stepped into the office. The room was crimson, red, and black. Shelves adorned the walls from the highest points down to my chest. Each one of them was filled with different kinds of taxidermy animals. Some were the squirrels I mentioned earlier, but Others were cats, some birds, and even a handful of dogs. Every single one of them was twisted into unnatural positions, limbs split and contorted into horrific shapes as every face stared into the void. Their faces as devoid of emotion and life as whatever was wearing my grandma's skin outside. The lack of terror, pain, and any connection to emotion was more horrifying than my mind knew what to do with. I knew better than to scream, but my eyes widened and I whimpered. I wanted to look away. I needed to look away. I began scanning this nightmarish room that seemed almost preferable to what was out there for anything that could provide a respite. I was just a child who wanted to scream, cry, and throw up. But there was an instinctual desire in me to hide, and that somehow superseded all other things. Dizzy and breathing heavy, my eyes darted to the far corner and saw a groove in the wall that didn't match the rest of the wallpaper. With some inspection and a slight push, it gave way to a crawl space that led to a smaller room. I was confused, as I knew there was nothing next to this but drywall, but I didn't care as I heard the footsteps begin to gain volume. Taking a deep breath, I ventured in and prayed that it was better than this. When I emerged, the room was bright, as if they were corporate building lights, but after my eyes adjusted, I realized it was the wallpaper. It was pure white from corner to corner, the floor a white marble. There wasn't a single dirty spot to be seen. It was beyond meticulous, blindingly so. Smaller than the room I was just in. It contained a study desk, some objects, and a few books adorning it with one open at its center. To the far corner, an old oak cupboard lay on its back, chains wrapping it twice over to create a straight jacket of metal, the wood worn and peeling where it had been strained against. Immediately, I was drawn to the desk and the books. I'd hoped there was a window or other door to find a way out of, but it was sealed off completely. Resigning myself to being there until Mom got back, I sat down and looked over what was in front of me. 20 years on, I don't recall much of what was there, partly because my mind tends to focus on the more horrifying things that stick out from that day as opposed to the less keep me up at night perpetually parts. Also because my Japanese is poor now and was even poorer then, given that my grandma and cousin were the only ones who tried to teach katakana to me. But what I do remember are the photos. Dozens of pictures of military men and women standing proudly in front of a huge complex. Some being herded into the gaping jaws of this unforgiving structure. Photos of wholesome encounters between officers intermixed with photos of what they were doing to the people there. Vivisections, burnings, things a child should never see. But it was the last two photos that began to paint the picture for me. In the first was a terrified Japanese woman in her early 20s being held down by two nurses as a drill is being pushed into the base of her skull. Her head has been shaved and she looks malnourished. Even though the photo is black and white, I could make out bruises on her face where she'd been beaten, blood trickling down the side of her head. In the second was the same situation, but the woman was no longer resisting. Her face was devoid of all emotion, and she was completely submissive. The orderlies were still holding her down with force, but there appeared to be zero resistance. She looked almost vacant from her body. There was a date on each photo, the first reading 1947, and the second 1949. I didn't want to think about the horror this person had faced over a 2-year period in order to become someone so disconnected from reality. But I wanted to keep exploring. So I tried to push it from my mind and carried on, reaching for the heavily bound book at the back of the table. It had no title, only an inscription that, even after many tries to replicate myself as an adult, bear no fruit and no resemblance. It was engraved into the center of a moss-green book with the face of a sculpted Greek god on the background, staring back at you. Theodore, where are you? Grandma's tired now, and Mom is here. Come on out. You win. My eyes snapped away. Grandma sounded gravelly again, and for whatever reason, I believed her. I suddenly felt exhausted and at ease, an almost intoxicating emotion overflowing me. I glanced once more at the book and over to the chained up cupboard before crawling back through the space and cautiously stepping into the taxidermy door, half expecting her to be standing on the other side. Instead, I could hear her humming downstairs with the faint smell of food wafting up the stairs. In that moment, while still incredibly unsettled by what I had seen, my 9-year-old mind pushed it to the back of my mind, knowing it would not only cause trouble if I admitted I'd snuck into somewhere I shouldn't, but the stark reminder that in a family household, you respect the elders and their secrets, even if you don't understand them. As I descended, Mum was waiting for me in the hallway, beaming and obviously eager to see me. "We've got to go. Wish Grandma goodbye and thank her for having you," Mum said softly. I walked up to Grandma, who had her back to me and tugged at her apron to say goodbye. As she turned, for the briefest of moments, I saw something flick across her face before it snapped back to a smile, like she forgot where she was. She kneeled down and gave me a hug, saying she looked forward to seeing me again to finish our game. She then whispered something into my ear before rising up and continuing with her cooking. Mum said goodbye and we drove off, almost completely in silence. As we exited the town Grandma lived in, Mum asked me how my time with her was, to which I brushed it off and told her it was fine. The last thing I wanted to do was worry her or cause any kind of rift between her and Grandma, particularly when she was already an intensely private woman.
"We had a nice time. She made me play hide and seek, and she never found me. You got back, so I guess she gave up."
"Hide and seek? Where'd you end up hiding? Grandma knows that place inside and out. If she wanted to find you, she would have, trust me."
"I hid in her special room on the 3rd floor."
Mum began to slow down the car. "Theodore, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to be completely honest with me, okay?" The pit of my stomach re-emerged, but I nodded. "I know you don't like being alone with her. You've always been a little scared of her, but did Grandma seem different to you while you were playing?" I stared. I wasn't sure what to say and too young to properly express what I'd seen. I did what any 9-year-old would do when they were frightened. I cried. I ended up crying so hard I was sick on the side of the road. Mum soothed me as we drove home, not talking about it again for a long time. I remember that night in bed hearing Mum have an argument with my dad before he had another one on the phone. Grandma died in 2010, when I was 19 and she was 82. Her funeral was short and sparsely attended, inhabited only by a few close relatives and some old friends from her youth. They offered condolences and smiles that felt insincere but were nonetheless appreciated. While the events of what had happened were mostly faded memories marred by time and my own desire to move past them, it was nonetheless still there, like a black shadow looming over me throughout the proceedings. But, of all people, it was my father who brought it up with me at the wake. He was a stout man of incredible strength and a sharp mind. He never minced words, but was always on hand to set me right or give me support I may need. His salt and pepper hair combed neatly to the side and tired eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He ushered me over to where he was sitting, a small table outside the pub, away from the mourners and my mother. The sounds outside were deafening, and a chance to sit and talk with him about anything but death was a welcome conversation. "How you doing, mate?" My dad put his hand on my shoulder, a weak smile flitting across his tired face. I didn't smoke myself, but I handed him a cigarette knowing he'd need one. "I'm fine, Dad." I knew it was going to happen sooner or later. Besides, I lit the cigarette and passed it to him, a gracious nod in return. "It was your mom. I imagine this is far harder on you than it is on me." He took a long drag, blew the smoke away from me and smiled. My mom was a complex person. Very hot and cold, but that was who she was. Never happy or sad for long, just floating in between. He looked up at the night sky. I'm glad she's at peace. Now she'll be the hider and I'll be the seeker. I felt a twitch run through my eyebrow. Something about that phrase irked me, but I couldn't place what. Chalking it up to tiredness, I ignored it. So, what do we get in the will? I assume the house and a ton of her finest china? I smiled, trying to get him to reciprocate. I mean, I need a new house, Dad, just saying, birthday is coming up. He gave me a playful shove. I was glad to distract him. You wish, mate. Finish your studies first. She actually did leave us all something, though. She put it all down on a piece of paper. Weird, even for her. What were they? I pressed, eager to see what weird trinket I'd inherited from that old house. Knowing Grandma had collected a lot of strange things along the way, I hoped it was one of her ornaments from Japan. I cultivated those growing up. He unfolded the piece of paper from his breast pocket, his brow furrowing as he tried to read katakana for the first time in years. Well, to me she left the house. Her record collection and some cigars she'd been saving. To your mom, she left an old tea set from Nagasaki, her cooking utensils, nightgowns, and what's left of her wine cellar. Knowing Mom, bloody doubt there's much left. He grumbled, his eyes flickering through the list, undoubtedly eager to see something of sentiment or monetary value. I laughed. Well, damn, not much left for me. I guess it'll just be an early birthday card with an incorrect age and a tenor? Mind your manners, you little sod. She did leave you something, Dad teased, trying to make sense of whatever it was. Well, go on. Disappoint me now so I'm not left in suspense. I smiled, feigned positivity giving way to genuine excitement. His eyes flashed and he grinned at me. 1 minute, I think you'll like this. He hurries inside with a few moments, comes back with a small bundle wrapped in a cloth, a small note attached. As he passes it to me, I eagerly unwrapped it. No sooner as I had seen the eyes, the limbs, the shape of the taxidermy squirrel, I dropped it to the ground in disgust and fear. Dad was howling with laughter. That's Grandma for you. She does this one time and you'll never get over it as a child. That woman had a sick sense of humor. But I was beyond his words, my eyes flashing with the memories of that afternoon when I was 9, the shelves upon the shelves of animals, her face bearing no expression, staring into my soul. My chest contracts and I struggle to breathe as I stare at the mangled creature on the floor in front of me. Realizing his error, Dad stops laughing and proceeds to calm me down. Theodore, what's wrong? I've never seen you like this. Concern wrapping his tired face, I wasn't sure what to even tell him. Those animals. I saw an entire room of them in Grandma's house when I stayed with her years ago. I sputtered between breaths. It was her special room on the 3rd floor next to the closet. In that moment, I saw something flicker across my dad's face I had never seen before. Panic. No, she boarded up that room before you were even old enough to walk, she promised. His eyes were shaking. Theo, I think you're confused. That room doesn't exist anymore. Maybe you were in the spare room? The wall was red and black. There was a table in the middle with a book and... Enough, that's enough, I believe you. He paced in front of me, struggling to vocalize his apparent concern, but clearly considering his next step. After a moment, he stared into space, and whatever he was looking for in his mind suddenly clicked. Turning on his heels, he walked towards me with a purpose and placed a hold on my shoulder. All right, this is a conversation I never thought I'd ever have to have with you, nor one that I ever wanted. But Grandma Effie clearly wanted this to come up, so here we are. I really thought she'd fix her obsession. She promised me she'd never let this happen again. He sighed and took a drag from his cigarette. She wasn't just a private woman. She was sick. Very, very sick. I know, I replied. She had cancer for a long time and refused treatment. She was stubborn, like Mom. No, Theo. Not that kind of sick. Not the kind of sick that can be treated. He stared at the table, unwilling to make eye contact. She had a mental affliction that ripped her from sanity, from everything around her. She would have these episodes that caused her to just stop being her, and would become something else. I didn't even know about it until a few years ago. He paused, took another drag, and stared at me. Theo, what happened when you stayed with her? Your mother and I have never pushed you on this, but I think now would be a good time to get it all out. I swallowed a lump in my throat as I recalled everything from that afternoon. The outfit, the face, the whispering, the rooms. I resigned myself and told him everything I could remember. To his credit, he sat without judgment and waited until the end. When I was done, he took a breath and removed his glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose as he composed himself. He waved my mom over, and that moment she saw the look on his face. She turned white, but she steeled her resolve and sat by his side, hand over his. We were lucky your mother got back when she did. I knew it was a mistake to leave you with her, and after she told me what happened to your grandma, I never let you near her alone again. What do you mean, what happened to her? I pressed, resigning to the fact that if I was going to have sleepless nights again, I may as well have the full picture of it. Mom cleared her throat, and a soothing voice cut the air, the sound of the wind proving an ominous backdrop.
Fukimo had a rare condition called callous syndrome, where her left brain and right brain didn't properly communicate. She would have moments where her right hand would reach for a knife and she would have to try and stop it with her left. Initially this was a minor issue, but she'd began to have these fits and sometimes a different person would come out. They would rarely speak and would always act violently to anyone who came near.
Dad's legs began shaking, but he pressed on. On more than one handful of occasions, your mother and later myself would need to call the hospital to restrain her. One of the trips she was on was to see a specialist in Harvard who said he would make her condition manageable with no damage to anyone around her. She took it soon after you were born, and when it came back, there was an immediate noticeable aura about her, like she was free but dangerous. She became more private, and we elected to respect that distance. I mean, what if she'd gotten better and just wanted space? I stared at him, mouth agape, and unable to think of anything to say, but the feeling in my stomach was getting worse the more he explained. The night after you came home in a state, I spoke with her and asked her what happened. She said you were playing a game with her, and she thought you may have hurt yourself, but she never found you until you came down to say goodbye. He sighed. His shoulder heaved under the burden of whatever he was carrying. Grandma Effie had a fascination with you since you were born, and we don't know why. She had 7 other grandchildren but refused to hold them or acknowledge them except you. The day Mom went out was on purpose. Effie said she needed time alone with you. We thought maybe she just wanted to talk to you. We always had our suspicions of her behaviors, but you have to understand this woman was very, very cautious. Nothing could be proven. He turned to face me, concern and guilt aging him before my very eyes. I know you saw something in that house. Something your mother and I could never prove. Something you've tried very hard to pretend wasn't what it actually was. You knew Grandma had a hobby, and you assumed in that dark room it was still her hobby. Stop. My eyes were watering, and I felt the bile rise in my stomach at the thought of those contorted limbs, those looks of terror. You knew she relished silence, valued privacy, and did anything to protect those 2 things. That's why she removed the squirrels from her garden, but those weren't squirrels in her room. Theodore, I know they weren't. Dad, please don't. I was pleading with him as he placed a hand over mine to reassure me. Nothing will happen to you. Don't worry, you're my son. You were just a boy. But this needs to end now that she's passed. But I have to know, Theodore. His hands shook and his voice croaked as he asked one thing that I was dreading the most. Images of those shelves flashed before me. The book that I spent hours sifting through and memorizing every page coming back to me like the tips for riding a bike. What did she say to you when you were leaving? There never was any photos, no animals on the shelves, no crawl space. My mind had done its best to conjure up a safe room while I dealt with what I had seen, innumerable children lining the walls, each one perfectly preserved and positioned, eyes bulging and staring unceasingly at the center of the room where a small ritualistic table sat. 2 pillars and a book resting in the center, the moss green cover emblazoned with an unusual symbol and a title across its spine in faded gold letters. The Expressionless, a guide to godhood. In it were teachings of how to utilize one's gift at an early age to hone them into tools that could benefit the user, an encouragement on discussing tactics at great length with one's other self, and listening to the voices in the head as a guiding light from the vacant mother. It had tips from everything on lying to officers, tracking, tool usage, disposal, and desirable traits down to things that to this day I still don't understand. On that day, I'd stumbled into something I was never meant to see, something that my entire family had never been allowed to see for over 30 years. The end result of Grandma Effie's habit. I took my hand away from my dad's and began running them up and down my arms as the realization came back to me. The last thing I remembered her saying before I left that day. Something that would haunt every future encounter.
I know what you saw.
I croaked. Dad's eyes widened as he scanned the room, noticing something before bringing his gaze back to me. Son, I know about the book. She mentioned it in passing before. She said it had a purchase history called a legacy club that housed a lot of loyal members. If she knows what you saw... He trailed off, finishing his cigarette with shaking fingers. We need to go to the police. Tell someone who can help us, I muttered. Won't do any good. Dad put his lighter away, steadying his hands. As I said, your grandma was very careful. There won't be anything. The most we can do is maintain the secret and hope it doesn't come back on us. I protested, but he shook his head, leading me out of the room and telling my mother we'd see her at home. Shaking and feeling my world fall apart beneath me, I moved on jelly legs. An elderly mourner held it open for me as I quietly thanked him.
Oh dear. It getting a bit too much for him, Justin?
The old lady crooned, looking at me. Yeah, he's just a bit rattled, that's all. Time to take him home. Thank you so much for coming, Eleanor. His voice was shaky, but he made sure he sounded sad.
Oh, it's no trouble at all,
Eleanor said, still looking at me as I walked towards the exit. She called after me.
After all, he's her legacy, isn't he?
I felt my pace pick up at that, getting into my car with Dad and driving home. Later, after hiring a PI at my insistence, we'd come to find she had indeed written a book. A mixture of religious ramblings and tips on how to harm animals. There was no record of who it had been sold to or where, leading them to believe if anyone had purchased it, they had done so face to face. As for the children, there was no sign of shelves upon shelves of broken children in her house. They chalked it up to an overreactive and protective imagination from a scared 9-year-old after seeing his grandma have an episode, particularly so when it came out that the white room I'd claimed to have entered was on no floor plans or accessible despite numerous attempts. With that, the secret was buried. Our lives continued on. It was largely never spoken of again, except in hushed tones on cold nights. Now, with my father having Alzheimer's disease and my mother getting on in years, I'm the last one left to know the truth. It dies with me. There was, however, one last thing that came about from this. In 2012, after writing The Expressionless and its sudden viral explosion, I was inundated with thousands of emails, many of which were asking for the origins of the character. Some were angry parents, the others were armchair literary critics, giving me a piece of their mind on it and my other works, but one stood out from the rest and ultimately was one of the driving forces behind why I elected to pull back the curtain and tell all of you where it came from. It was an email from a doctor in the UK whose daughter had read the original story and brought it to his attention, as he was a fan of horror short stories. Dear Theodore, I hope this finds you well. I don't actually know if this is your real email, but if it is, I wanted to tell you that I loved your story. It was simple and effective. Even if the ending was a tad weird, goodness knows how you came up with such an idea. I wanted to ask you though, is that all you remember?